In October of 1991, 20-year-old Brent Davis, who grew up in Newport, Rhode Island, traveled to New Bedford, Massachusetts to the Brick and Wood housing project. Sadly, a few days after arriving on October 25, 1991, a man who was identified as Bobby shot and killed Brent. However, when detectives tried to locate Bobby, they soon discovered that wasn't his real name. At the time, they were able to find two relatives of the suspect living in New Bedford who said Bobby was also known as Ronaldo Suriel and that he was from New York City. Still unable to find him, the case would go unsolved for the next 32 years. In 2023, the case was reopened, and investigators were able to track down several individuals who either knew Bobby or witnessed the shooting. From there, they were able to fill in a lot of missing pieces in the case. First of all, Ronaldo Suriel was also an alias, and he was from the Dominican Republic and had fled New Bedford after the murder. They also learned that Brent was killed after a dispute over drug distribution. One of the key witnesses confessed to selling drugs with Bobby at the time, and that Bobby came to his girlfriend's apartment immediately after murdering Brent. Once there, he confessed to the killing and said he needed to get out of town. A second key witness confirmed the story. They then tracked down a close relative of Bobby's who was able to provide his real name as Claudio Jorge, and that he was killed in the Dominican Republic in 2006. They also provided a photograph of Jorge, which matched the composite sketch from 1991. That photograph was shown to the key witnesses who knew him as Bobby, and they confirmed that it was him. Jorge had a long criminal record involving narcotics and weapons offenses. He was incarcerated in New York in 1983 for armed robbery and a shooting. He was arrested again in 1988 for narcotics and weapons offenses. The last time he was arrested in the United States was in 1992. 6 years later, he was deported back to the Dominican Republic. Investigators then contacted Jorge's family in the Dominican Republic and confirmed his death. While friends and family were frustrated that it took 32 years to solve the case, they are glad to have some long-awaited answers. Carol Ann Barrett was born on October 11, 1961, to parents Wayne and Patricia in Zanesville, Ohio. In 1980, 18-year-old Carol was a senior at Zanesville High School and was a member of the school's marching band. She was described as a very caring person who had once saved her 2-year-old niece by performing CPR on her after she almost drowned in a pool. She had been wanting to go to Florida for spring break, and while her parents initially said no, Carol was determined. So she began saving the money she made working at Wendy's restaurant, and by March of 1980, she had saved enough and her parents agreed to let her go. On March 23, 1980, Carol, along with a large group of friends that traveled from Ohio to Daytona Beach, Florida, and checked into the Treasure Island Hotel. As a side note, that motel has since been demolished. That night, around 2 a.m., an unknown man forced his way into the teenagers' 6th-floor hotel room carrying a .22 caliber revolver and robbed them of their belongings, including $200 cash. He then forced all of them except Carol onto the balcony and locked the sliding glass door so they couldn't get in. He then grabbed Carol and fled the scene with her. One of the teenage boys was then able to jump down to the balcony 1 floor down and get help. After kidnapping Carol, he drove 100 miles to Jacksonville, Florida, where he murdered her and left her body on the side of Interstate 95 near Pecan Park Road. A passerby discovered her body later that day. Carol's friends were able to provide a description of the man to investigators, but with no other information to lead them to the suspect, the case would go unsolved for the next 40 years. After reopening the case in 2017 and 2020, investigators were led to serial killer Billy Mansfield Jr. as a possible suspect, who would have been about 24 years old at the time. In order to confirm their theory, they traveled to California, where he is currently serving a life sentence, and interviewed him. After multiple interviews, Mansfield confirmed he was the man in the police sketch. He then went on to confess to the kidnapping and murder of Carol. Mansfield was sentenced to life in prison in 1982, 2 years after Carol's death. His first known murder occurred in 1973, and the last known murder was a month after he murdered Carol. 4 of his victims were found buried at the Mansfield family home. Of those victims were Renee Abby Saling, a mother of 3, 15-year-old Elaine Ziegler from Ohio, 21-year-old Sandra Jean Graham from Tampa, Florida, and recently identified victim 16-year-old Teresa Caroline Fillingham. Since Mansfield is already serving life in prison and has 4 concurrent life sentences in Florida, they've decided not to seek prosecution for Carol's murder. Dale Allen Ewell was born in Oxford, Ohio on October 11, 1932. He went on to marry Glee Ethel Mitchell, who was born on January 13, 1935 in Chicago, Illinois. By 1992, they had a 24-year-old daughter named Tiffany and a 21-year-old son named Dana and were living in Sunnyside, California. Dale was a very successful businessman who owned and operated Western Piper Sales, and Glee worked as an assistant director for the Fresno Regional Foundation. However, as you will soon find out, their children, Tiffany and Dana, were polar opposites, with one childhood friend describing Tiffany as an angel and Dana as a demon. Tiffany had graduated from Fresno State University, and Dana was a United States Air Force veteran who earned a finance degree from Santa Clara University. Dana loved the wealth that his father earned, and in college, he flaunted that as if it were his own, even though he wasn't involved in the business at all. He would wear suits to class and carry a briefcase and told fellow students that he became a stockbroker at 18 and currently owned a company that grossed $2.8 million a year. He was even able to fool the Santa Clara newspaper and the university's yearbook, and in 1990, they both printed stories depicting him as a self-made millionaire. When his parents found out about the lies, they were upset and decided to end their financial support of him. They also altered the will so he wouldn't have full access to their estate until he was in his 30s. Unfortunately, Dana had spent a lot of his youth fabricating stories about where he was born and falsely claiming that his parents were abusive. The lies got so bad that it created a wedge between him and his parents. Dale wasn't happy with his son's sense of entitlement and with the fact that he never seemed to appreciate the things they did for him. For Dana, nothing was ever enough. While still in college, Dana met Joel Radovich, who believed all of Dana's stories. He was also impressed with Dana's smooth-talking ability, which made it easy for him to pick up girls. Joel, on the other hand, was addicted to drugs and played video games constantly. He was very introverted, but meeting Dana opened up a new world for him, full of parties and girls. In 1992, after Dana's falling out with his parents, he came up with a plan to become a millionaire and involved Joel in the plan. So, what was this genius plan? Well, he planned to murder his family and inherit their fortune. He needed Joel to be the hitman because he figured he would be looked at immediately and needed an airtight alibi. As for the alibi itself, he chose to go out of town with his girlfriend Monica Zent and her FBI father 200 miles away from the Ewell family home. On Easter Sunday, April 19, 1992, with the plan in motion, Joel made his way inside the Ewell home with a 9mm assault rifle with a homemade silencer on it and a sheet of plastic that he put on the floor and laid on. He then waited for 12 hours for Dale, Glee, and Tiffany to return from their beach house in Pajaro Dunes, California. Glee and Tiffany were the first to arrive home and, immediately upon entering the house, were shot and killed. Dale came 30 minutes later because he chose to fly one of his small planes to the beach. As he pulled up to the house, he was unaware that his wife and daughter were dead inside. Just like Glee and Tiffany, when he entered the home, he was immediately shot and killed. Unfortunately, their bodies weren't discovered until 2 days later. Dana had been clearly waiting for the murders to be discovered, and after 2 days of waiting, he began calling family friends in Sunnyside, telling them he was unable to reach his parents. On Tuesday, April 21, 1992, the family's housekeeper arrived and discovered their bodies after entering the home. She ran to a neighbor's home and the police were called. Investigators spent the next 4 days collecting clues and determined that the scene was staged to look like a robbery gone wrong. They also noted that the killer had a remarkable aim and only missed one shot. Before investigators focused on Dana as a possible suspect, They looked into Dale's past and discovered that he sold airplanes in the 1970s for a man named Frank Lamb, who was convicted of drug smuggling. After being convicted, Dale took over the business. They also discovered that Dale was involved in a real estate development deal with his brother Ben that went south and ended up costing the investors millions. However, once those were ruled out, their next suspect was Dana. People began to notice that Dana wasn't exactly grieving. Even before the blood from the murders was cleaned up, he invited a friend to tour the house. He even told that friend that the police will never solve this case. They are dummies. Then one of his uncles contacted investigators and told them about Dana's reaction to the reading of the will when he found out that he wouldn't receive full access to the $8 million estate until he was 35 years old. His uncle said he was so mad he punched the desk and shouted, "How could he have done this to me?" referring to his father. With his uncles now suspicious of his involvement in the murders, they tried to block Dana from collecting money, but he ended up getting $300,000 from a life insurance payment. Even though Dana had a rock-solid alibi, investigators were still very suspicious of him. They also became suspicious of Joel after he abruptly dropped out of college shortly after the murders. A few weeks later, the men moved into the family home. They then started spending the money on things such as helicopter flight lessons. He also bought his girlfriend a new car and began paying her law school tuition. After spending all the money, he was able to con his grandmother, who was in a nursing home, out of $400,000, leaving her with only $2,000 to pay her bills. They also obtained pagers and would use payphones to communicate in an effort to hide their conversations. At some point, detectives brought Dana in and asked him about Joel. They said Dana got very upset and said he wasn't going to talk about it and left their office in a hurry. Investigators then spotted the men at a pager store. After they left, the detective went in and questioned the owner, who said that Joel asked him if anyone had come in with a search warrant for his pager. Joel also asked the owner to change his name to Mike Smith on his pager account. Investigators then came up with a plan. In May of 1993, a detective wore a recording device and stood super close to Joel while he was talking on a payphone. He overheard Joel say, "They don't have evidence. They will try to catch you in a lie." They also had Dana's pager cloned and wiretapped his landline. Probably the biggest piece of evidence came from the murder weapon. Forensics were able to trace the murder weapon to Feather Industries in Trinidad, Colorado. Once they had that information, they were able to trace the purchase to Ernest Ponce, who went by Jack. Jack was a high school friend of Joel's who bought the gun shortly before the murders. When questioned by police, Ernest admitted to buying the gun for Joel, but denied knowing it was used in the crime. However, that was a lie because he was caught trying to conceal evidence after the murders by wiping down the guns with lubricant before discarding them. He was then arrested on an accessory charge, but was granted immunity from prosecution after agreeing to testify against Dana and Joel. Come to find out, Joel's brother Peter was also involved in the crime. He was the one who made the homemade silencer and welded it to the weapon. After the murder, he worked with Jack to dispose of the gun barrel, Joel's tennis shoes he wore during the murder, and a stack of gun enthusiast magazines. Just like Jack, Peter was given immunity for testifying against Dana and Joel. With all the evidence pointing at the two men, they were arrested on March 2, 1995, almost 3 years later, and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. While the jury found both men guilty, they deadlocked when it came to the sentencing phase. The judge then defaulted their sentences to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of 2024, both men are still alive and remain behind bars. Jessie Marietta Blodgett was born on March 22, 1994, in Marietta, Georgia, the only child to parents Buck and Joy. At some point, her family moved to the small town of Hartford, Wisconsin, and in 2012, Jessie graduated from Hartford Union High School. She was a very talented piano and violin player, and after graduation, she received a talent scholarship from the School of Music Education at the nearby University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. After enrolling, she received a campus job mentoring disadvantaged inner-city university students and began teaching voice, piano, and violin lessons to 28 young students. On the morning of July 15, 2013, after Jessie's father had left for work, her mother, Joy, went into Jessie's room with some laundry and saw her sleeping. She then left her room and headed off to work. When she returned for lunch, she called out for Jessie, but strangely received no response. She went to check on her, and this time she realized her daughter was dead. Even more strange was the fact that Jessie's hair and pants were wet, and there was duct tape under her bed. She called 911 and tried to perform CPR, but it was too late. An autopsy determined that Jessie had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. They also discovered bite marks around her neck and wrist. While investigators found no signs of forced entry, the Blodgett family did admit that they seldom locked the doors, since it was a small community with very little crime. Even with that, investigators were sure that her murderer was familiar with the house. They then decided to focus on Jessie's last day. Joy told them that Jessie had been out celebrating the success of her theater production of Fiddler on the Roof. The celebration was a pool party that included fellow cast and crew members. While it was an exciting night, Joy noted that her daughter seemed upset and distraught when she arrived home at 12:30 a.m. Apparently, Jessie was upset about two 40-year-old men at the party who were inappropriately flirting with her. One of those men was making inappropriate jokes toward her, while the other tried to pull her down onto his lap. After arriving home that night, she detailed the unwanted attention in her journal. Investigators questioned people who attended the party and were able to quickly track down the two men. The man making inappropriate jokes was quickly ruled out, but the other man had strangely failed to show up to work the day of the murder. Even though he acted strange when questioned by police, they discovered his cell phone records didn't put him anywhere near the Blodgett home that night. Since there was no physical evidence to tie him to the crime, he was ruled out as well. At that point, investigators were at a loss until they received a break in the case from a woman named Melissa Etzler. Melissa had been attacked by a man in the parking lot of a local park while she had been walking her dog a few days before Jessie's murder. The man had attacked her with a knife, but she managed to escape by holding onto the blade with her bare hand. Thankfully, she was able to provide investigators with a detailed description of her attacker. Melissa described the man as a young guy with blonde, shaggy hair. She said he wore glasses and drove a blue Dodge Caravan. It turns out the detective on the case had spotted a similar vehicle around the park a few weeks before and had jotted down the license plate and the registration details. When they traced the vehicle, it linked back to 19-year-old Daniel Bartelt. When they called Daniel, they were shocked to find him with Jessie's parents at their home. Daniel was an ex-boyfriend of Jessie's from high school, but he ended their relationship when he went off to college. Joy was shocked when she found out because, as she said, Daniel was a talented musician, a straight-A student, and usually got the lead role in most of the musicals he tried out for. During the interview with Daniel, he denied having anything to do with Jessie's murder and claimed he was at the park instead. They checked surveillance and confirmed he was definitely at the park, but they still felt they had the right guy. At that point, they began ransacking all the trash cans in the area and finally discovered a cereal box stuffed full of ropes, bloody sanitizing wipes, and tape. When they tested the DNA on those items, it linked right back to Jessie and Daniel. His DNA was also found on the sexual assault kit, proving he was the murderer. They also checked his internet search history and found that he had Googled information about serial killers and had watched disturbing adult films similar to the murder in the days leading up to the crime. He was then arrested and charged with her murder. In October 2014, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of 2024, he continues to maintain his innocence, but as we all know, DNA doesn't lie. Karen Ann Alexander was born on September 28, 1966, and her brother Gordon Dale Alexander was born on December 10, 1967, both to Weldon and Vera Alexander in Cass County, Texas. In 1981, 14-year-old Karen and 13-year-old Gordon were living with their parents in the Carmichael Hill neighborhood of Texarkana, Arkansas. On April 8, 1981, their mother Vera was at the hospital being treated for depression, and their father, Weldon, was working the overnight shift at Cooper Tires, leaving the kids home alone. Gordon had hip surgery back in February and was still confined to a wheelchair. When Weldon returned the following morning at 7 a.m., he found the screen door and the wooden front door slightly ajar. When he walked in, he sadly found Gordon dead in the kitchen and Karen barely alive on her bed near the living room. She still had a kitchen knife in her, which Weldon removed and placed on a nearby bookshelf. Karen was then rushed to St. Michael Hospital, but after 3 days in a coma, she died from her injuries. The autopsy determined that Karen had been sexually assaulted a few days before she was stabbed, beaten, and strangled. They also determined she had likely been sexually assaulted for about 6 months leading up to her death. Investigators at the scene determined that the murder weapon was a butter knife. They also, strangely, found no signs of forced entry. The Hopkins family, who lived across the street, reportedly saw a man in a blue truck leaving the house before Weldon arrived home. Investigators even found tire track impressions in the driveway. If you're like me, you're probably tired of hearing his name, but it's part of the case and I feel obligated to mention it. Henry Lee Lucas took credit for the murders and was even charged in the case. However, Lucas was not the murderer, and after his involvement in the case, it would go unsolved for the next 42 years. In 2022, retired Captain Calvin Seward, who in 1981 was a patrol officer who lived in the same neighborhood as the Alexanders and never forgot the case, was given full freedom to reopen it. Over the next 18 months, Seward identified, interviewed, and re-interviewed dozens of people named in the original case, and many of their associates. He also had the benefit of advancements in DNA technology to help in the case. They first uploaded the DNA profiles they had to CODIS, but there was no matches. They then had DNA extracted from both victims' fingernail tissue and were shocked at the results. The DNA came from someone related to Karen and Gordon, their father, Weldon. Not only was his DNA under their fingernails, but his DNA was collected from Karen's bedding, which showed he was the one who sexually assaulted her. They also learned that when investigators arrived at the scene in 1981, they found Gordon's body was cold to the touch, meaning he had been dead for hours. At that point, it was looking more and more like Weldon murdered his own children. One last piece of crucial evidence was dried blood found on Gordon and Karen's hands. When that was tested, they found it contained fibers, brass, copper, and zinc, all of which were materials used in the construction of tires where their father worked. Unfortunately, they couldn't re-interview Weldon because he died in 2014 at the age of 80. As for Vera, she took her own life in 1984 at the age of 37. Captain Seward's theory is that Weldon was attempting to sexually assault Karen once again, and Gordon heard his sister trying to stop it and intervened. However, all that did was anger Weldon, so he grabbed a butter knife and began stabbing them. He then left for his 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift and didn't report the crime until he returned the next morning on April 8, 1981. This means the murders actually took place on April 7th. He probably also didn't expect Karen to still be alive. It makes me wonder if Vera took her own life in 1984 because Weldon finally told her what he did. Unfortunately, we will never know.